Alright, so while he's getting that up, I'll quickly introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Anton-Erik. I've been a developer at Getty Images for 4 years now. I've been a professional software developer for somewhere between 12 and 15 years, depending on how you count. And I've been a big TDD guy, so I like everything he had to say. Thanks, Gary. Now I'm going to say some stuff that probably you'll disagree with. So it'll be interesting. It should provide some fodder for discussion afterwards, I would think. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about behavior-driven development, BDD. I think it is essentially very similar to TDD, but with a slightly different focus, namely the focus being around so-called business behaviors or business value instead of being focused around code behaviors, like what the code is doing. We want to talk about why the code is doing what it's doing. So, so this is our world, people. I mean, we deal with business value at one end of the extreme. On the business side, the business is telling us through our product owners or whatever what they want in some way. And down at the bottom, it's what we're here to do. We're here to write working software. And somehow we have to bring those two things together, and that's perennially an issue in software development. So there have been a lot of practices and approaches that evolved over time, including approaches like TDD, to try to kind of bridge the gap here in the middle and give us a way to know that the working software that we've written actually meets the business value, and to know that what the business value is before we can even start writing the software, because what's the point of writing software if you don't know what it's doing? You're just basically playing around. So so that's kind of the rationale for BDD. I think it provides an approach that allows us to strategically kind of bridge this gap at a high level, being able to keep track of some various concerns that go on, in a larger enterprise. We've got product managers and product owners and things like that. So it all starts with scenarios. In BDD world, it's all about scenarios. A scenario is simply a description of a desired behavior. It uses a very simple, largely textual format with minimal syntactical rules to it, and it expresses the behavior in terms of the business domain and its entities, not in terms of what the code is doing, not in terms of what the objects are involved, things like that. And so it's regardless of possible implementations. There's numerous ways we could implement this scenario, and nothing in this description of the behavior that the business wants in the scenario says anything about how it might possibly be implemented. So just in case people have never seen a scenario before, some of you probably have, but maybe you haven't. This is the Gherkin format. It's pretty popular in Cucumber and the Ruby community. It starts with scenario, keyword, and then just a statement, and that captures kind of the business value for the story. Getty Images premium access customers should be authorized to download premium access images. You don't need to worry about what premium access is, it's just one of our product types. So this is a statement that kind of captures some of the preconditions in a given, a when statement that actually describes state transition in the system, and then one or more then statements that kind of express what should be true after the fact. So some of those points that I mentioned, like in the business domain and its entities. So you can see that I'm referencing customer, right? That's something that exists in the Getty Images domain. It exists in a lot of companies' domains. So we have a concept of customer. We have a concept of an agreement. We have a concept of a process of downloading an image, another concept. So this expresses something that the business wants, but it's all in terms of the business entities and the domain, what the business actually does. So one thing I like to do with scenarios to kind of lead into how I like to think about BDD is kind of show people how scenarios are usually implicit in what you're doing already. So here's a unit test. Not necessarily a TDD-derived unit test, but do that as it may. And I think this is a pretty good unit test, actually. I'd be really happy if if I looked at unit tests like this every day. So I'm not knocking myself for this unit test, but I think there's some issues with it, some things I want to call out, some ways we could make it better. So for one is we've got some mixed concerns here. It's not really clear, what the concern of each particular line of code is. For example, the class that contains the tests, it's called Premium Access Agreement Authorizes Download. Okay, that's not too bad. I mean, it kind of indicates something about the business value. But then down here on the actual test method, it says authorizations are returned, which is kind of bordering in implementation-specific language, because we're talking about that authorizations are returned by a particular property, we'd call. So we're mixing levels here. We've got this great high-level expression of what the business wants, but down here we're saying things about what the code is doing. So there's the biggest problem really, to kind of generalize that, is to say that a lot of our test code is really dealing with code concerns. It's all about expressing the how of what the code's doing. Oh, you call this property, you pass this parameter, so on and so forth. And that stuff really obscures the value of why you're writing the code. What is the purpose for this? So sometimes developers, when they're learning TDD and unit testing, hear about so-called 3A's testing pattern: arrange, act, assert. And so I kind of highlighted for you the various sections here that might fall into that sort of pattern. Arrange is just setting up some sort of context. It's instantiating the objects, passing the image that we want to have authorized for download. The act is actually doing the action, and then you can have any number of asserts that verify the behavior. So hopefully, it's pretty clear when I describe it that way that you can see that this maps pretty cleanly to the concept of the sequence of givens that I had in the scenario. And the act is something's happening, so that is obviously a win. And then any asserts that we have can be interpreted as the then in the scenario. So I've already started to kind of pull out a little bit of the implicit scenario structure that was in this test, but it wasn't clearly explicit. So we could go another step and try to make it a little bit more explicit. A lot of developers, when they're getting started with TDD, realize at some level that this is a problem with what they're doing. So they might put in some comments like, oh, I need an image, I need a customer who has an active premium access agreement, agreement authorizing download, check authorizations, we should have an authorization. Well, that's great, but why stop there? We've got comments that are very expressive and meaningful. Let's just take it to the next step and actually convert them to methods. So here's the final step of refactoring that test into something that's very scenario-like. I've moved all the logic that was there behind methods that, just for the sake of the example, I put them up in a base class, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I've got a method given a customer. Behind the scenes, this method does the work of instantiating a customer object. Given the customer has a premium access agreement, given the agreement is active, given the agreement downloads an image, or authorizes the download of an image, when authorizing the customer to download the image, then the customer is authorized to download the image. So it's a very readable expression of what the behavior is, again, without indicating anything about how it's actually implemented. So I think this is kind of cool. I think even at this level, if you don't go any further, there's a lot of value to be gained from this kind of approach. We found that scenarios are very effective communication mechanism for us to talk with our product owners about what the behaviors they want are and so on. So, I think that's a great place to start, is even just grappling with the idea of defining behaviors in a way that's, agnostic towards the implementation. But there are some really cool things that you can do now that you've gotten to the point of decoupling an expression of behavior from the code that actually verifies that behavior, that actually gives meaning to these statements by manipulating something somewhere. So that's kind of the big idea for BDD that we have here at Getty that we talk a lot about. I think it's implicit in a lot of stuff you read about BDD, but in us grappling with it, we've really had to make it an explicit concept. So we have this concept that we call target. And a target is simply a logical entity that we introduce to identify a collaboration of some sort that provides a cohesive behavior. So what does that mean? Okay, well, what it means is, and this is where we're probably going to differ, is my approach to so-called unit testing is the units that I'm really interested in are the units of collaboration that provide behavior. Okay? I'm not very interested in testing units of code because typically, even though in an ideal world the units of code would map cleanly to the units in our domain and the units of behavior, especially if you are doing a TDD approach, you often end up with a design that reflects that very well. But the reality is you're dealing with legacy systems, you're dealing with distributed behaviors across enterprises in our case, or across the internet if you're doing some sort of mashup or something like that. So we found it a much more useful concept to define the set of dependencies that we want to actually target the scenario to execute against. So that can be anything from a class to an assembly, to a collaboration of classes and assemblies, whatever level of systems that you want to define. You just say, this is what I'm targeting, these are all the dependencies, this is everything that I need. We use Anthill Pro as a continuous integration system, and that's actually what we use to define our targets. And so because Anthill Pro is a great tool for managing dependencies between different projects. So that's essentially what we're doing here, is we're managing dependencies. So once we've defined a target, we can now bind the code to the target to actually manipulate the system. So this is the scenario we looked at before, and I just want to call out on one particular statement here. Given the agreement, it authorizes download of an image. So at runtime, when I execute this scenario, there needs to be some actual code back here that executes through this. In this case, it's going to be this code right here. So, which you saw in that earlier unit test. We have an agreement object, we call the authorizes method on it, pass it an image. So, I've decoupled the scenario from an actual piece of code that gives meaning to the scenario by manipulating the system. Once I've done that decoupling, I can do a really cool thing, which is essentially a form of strategy pattern. This is where targets really start to come into play. Is that I've defined a target that provides this implementation for this method. I've defined another target that provides this implementation for this statement in the scenario. What that allows me to do, if you look at this, so this is pretty low level. This is manipulating a class, calling a method on it, passing another object. This is some higher level code. This is actually going to exercise the same scenario, but it's going to exercise the system at a higher level, where we actually have some mocking coming into play. So we set up a mock that, set up the method, and we've got these data structures we call user bundles, which is actually how we manage authorizations internally. And so this particular implementation for this target allows me to verify this same scenario against a different aspect of the system by having defined a different target that kind of encapsulates the system in a different way. Once you've done that, you're to here. This is kind of the big picture view of BDD, is that you've got the flexibility now to define the coverage into your systems however you want. You define targets that are the sets of dependencies. Every target has a binding that's specific to that target, and then you use some mechanism, usually provided by the tool, but it's essentially a form of strategy pattern. So you just have some mechanism that allows you to swap out different bindings for each particular scenario that you're actually executing when you're executing at runtime. That's BDD. Did I get it in 10 minutes?
Yeah, pretty close.
All right. Yeah, just the closing statement. I guess I forgot the last slide. It's kind of bringing it all together. To me, BDD is about the union of these different concepts. Scenarios that describe the business value, targets and bindings that actually are how we grapple with the physical systems that are involved and think about those things. And with these three concepts working together, in concert, we've established, I think, pretty effective testing strategy in several of our teams.